What if the biggest secret of the Cold War was a $100 million offer to an American nobody from the KGB? This ain't the story about war with tanks and missiles, but it's the war with secret weapon which you can see even today. This year is 1980. The Cold War, a silent, deadly chess game, gripped the world. But the most shocking move wasn't made by presidents or generals. It was made in a dimly lit hotel room by an unassuming American salesman named John Smith, who just stared at a briefcase containing $100 million. Not from some corporate giant, not from some shadowy corporation, but from Moscow, the very heart of the Soviet Union, a nation sworn to be America's mortal enemy. This wasn't a movie plot. This was real, and it wasn't a clean deal. It was a deal soaked in secrets, fear, and a desperate gamble that could either make him the richest man he knew or sign his death warrant. John Smith, a man struggling to make rent, a man invisible to the world, had somehow become the most valuable pawn in a global game of espionage. How did he get here? What could he possibly offer the Soviets that was worth more than the GDP of a small country? And why him? The truth, as it always is far stranger and more terrifying than fiction. How did a man invisible to his own country become so incredibly valuable to its greatest enemy? Meet John Smith. Not his real name, of course. For decades, the true identity of the man at the center of this incredible story remained a closely guarded secret, buried deep within intelligence archives. But the details of his life before the infamous offer are concrete, painful, and entirely unglamorous. John Smith wasn't born into privilege. He didn't come from a family of spies or politicians. He was just John, a guy from a small town in Ohio with a receding hairline, a perpetually rumpled suit, and a smile that rarely reached his tired eyes. He was a door-to-door salesman, peddling industrial refrigeration units in the Rust Belt. Think about that for a second. Refrigeration units. In the early 80s, this wasn't exactly a booming market. Factories were closing, jobs were vanishing, and John, he was barely clinging on. Every morning, John would wake up in his modest, slightly run-down apartment. He'd brew stale coffee, stare at the mounting bills on his kitchen counter, and try to convince himself that today was the day he'd turn it all around. His car, a beat-up Ford Pinto, smelled faintly of old coffee and desperation. His phone book, thick with dog-eared pages, was filled with names he'd called 100 times, only to be met with polite rejections or outright hostility. He wasn't bad at his job, not really. He was just in the wrong place at the wrong time selling the wrong product. He was the definition of ordinary, a man who blended into the wallpaper, whose presence made no ripples. He had no powerful connections, no secret past, no military training. He was just trying to keep his head above water, dreaming of a steady paycheck, maybe even a vacation someday. He was a true American everyman, a testament to the quiet struggles of millions. But here's the twist. It was precisely this ordinariness, this lack of distinction, that made John Smith the perfect target. The intelligence community, both East and West, often looked for the quiet, overlooked figures, the ones who could move through society unnoticed, the ones who wouldn't raise alarms. And John? He was practically invisible. He had access to businesses, factories, and warehouses, places where a salesman wouldn't be questioned. He was a master of small talk, of gaining trust, even if that trust rarely led to a sale. He was a chameleon, adapting to each new client, learning their needs, their routines. He understood the nuances of American industry, the ins and outs of logistics, the bottlenecks of supply chains. He knew about inventory, cold storage, and the subtle ways goods moved across the country. He knew the jargon, the local politics, the petty grievances of plant managers. He was a walking encyclopedia of mundane but crucial details about American manufacturing infrastructure. At home, his life was equally unremarkable. A few friends, mostly other struggling salesmen who'd commiserate over cheap beers, no family to speak of, a divorce many years prior, and children who had grown distant. He was, in essence, a lone wolf without even realizing it. No strong ties that would make him a liability, no deep-seated ideologies that would make him predictable. He was a blank slate filled only with the everyday worries of an American trying to make ends meet. This very emptiness, this void in his life, would soon become the perfect vacuum for a foreign power to fill. They didn't need a zealot. They didn't need an ideologue. They needed someone desperate, someone who saw a way out. And John Smith, with his worn-out shoes and his empty wallet, was desperately looking for a way out. The Cold War wasn't just fought with missiles and tanks. It was fought in the quiet desperation of ordinary lives, and the spaces where ambition met opportunity, or in John's case, where desperation met a life-altering, terrifying offer. The stage was set. But how does it down on his luck refrigeration salesman even get on the radar of the most feared intelligence agency in the world? This is where the story pivots from mere hardship to baffling intrigue. For a man like John Smith, the idea of having any interaction with the Soviet Union, let alone its intelligence apparatus, would have been ludicrous. He barely knew where Moscow was on a map, let alone understood its political machinations. His world revolved around compressors and cooling systems, not communism and clandestine operations. Yet the initial connection, the spark that ignited this whole improbable saga, was so mundane, so innocent, that it almost defies belief. It began, as many things do in the world of sales, with a cold call. A particularly tough week had John driving further and further out of his usual territory, chasing down any lead, no matter how remote. He found himself in a drab industrial park on the outskirts of a major East Coast city, pulling up to an address that, on his sales sheet, simply read, Transcontinental Export and Import Co. He'd never heard of them. The building itself was nondescript, with tinted windows and a small, faded sign. It looked less like a bustling export company and more like a front for, well, he wasn't sure what. But a lead was a lead. John walked in, his sample case clutched tight. The waiting room was sparse, almost sterile. No bustling employees, no ringing phones, just a single stern-looking receptionist who regarded him with an unnervingly blank expression. He asked to speak to a manager about the refrigeration needs. A few tense minutes passed, and then a man emerged. He introduced himself as Mr. Petrov. Petrov was impeccably dressed, spoke with a subtle, almost imperceptible accent, and possessed an air of quiet authority that John, used to haggling with factory foremen, found disarming. Petrov didn't waste time. He listened patiently to John's sales pitch, nodded occasionally, but his eyes, sharp and assessing, seemed to look right through John, past the worn suit and the rehearsed lines, and into something deeper. He asked surprisingly detailed questions, not just about refrigeration units, but about their transport, their installation in various climates, their energy consumption, and crucially, their supply chain. He wanted to know how quickly parts could be sourced, where they were manufactured, and what the typical bottlenecks were. John, ever the diligent salesman, answered every question honestly, believing he was simply discussing a large potential order. He was thrilled. This Petrov guy seemed genuinely interested, not just politely dismissing him. The initial meetings were surprisingly productive, or so John thought. Petrov placed a small order, a trial run for a few specialized units. This was a win, a rare beacon of hope in John's dismal sales record. He was elated. He started seeing Petrov more often, discussing logistics, delivery schedules, and payment terms. Petrov always paid on time, sometimes even in cash, which, while unusual for a corporate client, John dismissed as a quirk of international business. He was just happy for the commissions. But soon, the requests from Petrov started to subtly shift. They became less about refrigeration units themselves and more about the information surrounding them. Petrov would casually ask about the manufacturers, about the security protocols at the warehouses where they were stored, about the shipping routes, the type of trucks used, the specific types of cold storage facilities available in various port cities. John, eager to please a good client, provided everything he could, thinking he was simply being helpful. He even went so far as to draw diagrams of warehouse whiteouts, explaining how different types of cargo were stored and moved, how security checks were conducted. He knew all this mundane detail because it affected his ability to deliver and install his products. To him, it was just part of the job. What John didn't realize was that Transcontinental Export and Import Company was a classic Soviet front organization, a perfectly plausible, seemingly innocuous business designed to provide cover for intelligence gathering. And Mr. Petrov? He was no ordinary import manager. He was a highly trained KGB officer, a resident in intelligence parlance, meticulously building a network of assets and gathering critical industrial and logistical intelligence. He wasn't interested in refrigeration units. He was interested in the arteries of American commerce, the veins of its industrial might. He was mapping it. He was identifying its vulnerabilities. John, with his intimate knowledge of obscure details, his unchallenged access to various industrial sites, and his desperate need for income, was an accidental goldmine.
He wasn't being recruited for espionage in the traditional sense. He was being harvested for information, unknowingly providing a critical puzzle piece to the Soviet mosaic of American weaknesses. Each small piece of information John unwittingly provided, each diagram, each casual observation, was a data point for Moscow, building a comprehensive picture of American industrial infrastructure. They weren't looking for state secrets, not yet. They were looking for the mundane, the overlooked, the boring details that, when aggregated, painted a devastatingly clear picture for their analysts back home. And John, unknowingly, was their eyes and ears. His ordinariness, his lack of suspicion, made him the perfect, untraceable conduit.
Was not a spy, not yet. He was simply a man trying to sell refrigerators, completely oblivious that he was already entangled in a web far more dangerous than he could ever imagine. The fishing line was cast, and John had taken the bait, hook, line, and sinker. Was this a trap, a cruel joke, or the most audacious gamble in intelligence history, played out with an unwitting American as the pawn? The small trial orders kept coming from Mr. Petrov, then larger ones. John's bank account, once perpetually in the red, started to show signs of life. He bought himself a new, albeit modest, car. He started paying off old debts. He even allowed himself to dream a little, imagining a future where he wasn't constantly on the brink. This newfound stability was addictive. It dulled any nagging suspicions he might have had about the unusual nature of his biggest client. Petrov was demanding, yes, but he paid well and promptly, and John needed the money, desperately. Petrov's requests, however, continued their subtle, insidious shift. He started asking John to travel, not just around Ohio, but to other industrial centers across the country. He needed John to assess potential refrigeration needs for new, prospective clients John never actually met. Instead, Petrov would provide addresses, often of large factories, military contractors, or critical infrastructure sites. John was told to observe, to note security measures, access points, types of vehicles entering and leaving, even the routines of personnel. He was given a simple camera, an early model 35mm, and instructed to take photos of exterior facades, loading docks, and anything that looked interesting from a logistical standpoint. John rationalized it all. He was performing market research for a demanding, wealthy client. He was simply gathering data for future sales proposals. He told himself this repeatedly, pushing down the growing unease in his gut. The places Petrov sent him were often too sensitive, too important for a refrigeration salesman to be casually nosing around. He started to feel eyes on him, a prickling sensation on the back of his neck. He felt like he was constantly being watched, though he could never pinpoint anyone. His life, once so unremarkable, was suddenly filled with an exhilarating, terrifying edge. He was traveling, staying in nicer hotels, making good money, but at what cost? One rainy Tuesday, Petrov called John to a meeting, not in the sterile office of Transcontinental, but in a quiet, out-of-the-way restaurant booth, away from prying eyes. John walked in, his heart pounding a little faster than usual. Petrov looked more serious than ever. He didn't order food. He just looked at John, his gaze unblinking. "John," began Petrov, his voice low, "you have been invaluable to our company. Your knowledge, your diligence, your ability to observe, it is truly remarkable." John, flattered and nervous, mumbled a "thank you." "We believe you have a unique talent," Petrov continued, leaning forward slightly, "a talent for understanding the intricate workings of American industry. A talent we believe could be utilized on a much grander scale, for a much grander reward." Then came the words that stopped John's breath. Petrov pushed a thick manila envelope across the table. "This is not about refrigeration, John. This is about information. Information that only you can provide, giving your access and your unique skills." John opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside wasn't a sales contract. It was a single typed page, stark against the cheap paper. It was an offer of $1 million for a specific ongoing task. The details were vague, but the implication was chillingly clear. He would be providing intelligence on specific American industrial targets. And then a second page. It described a tiered bonus structure, escalation clauses, and a final, staggering payout of $100 million upon completion of a major project. A project so critical, so vital, that its details were left entirely blank. A blank check, essentially, for betrayal.
A cold dread washed over John. $100 million. For him, a nobody. It was more money than he could ever conceive of. It was freedom, security, escape from the grind. But the source, the unspoken source of this unbelievable fortune hung heavy in the air, thick with unspoken threats and unimaginable consequences. This wasn't some shady business deal gone a little sideways. This was an invitation to the abyss. This was a recruitment by the KGB. Petrov watched John's face carefully, reading every flicker of emotion. Think of it, John. A new life, complete financial freedom, no more struggling, no more worries. All you have to do is continue what you've already been doing, but now with purpose, with a mission. John's mind raced. He thought of his empty bank account, his lonely apartment, the endless rejections. He thought of the decades of missed opportunities. He thought of the promise of a life beyond his wildest dreams. But he also thought of treason, of what this meant, of what would happen if he was caught. He looked up at Petrov, his face pale. Who are you really?" John managed to stammer, his voice barely a whisper. Petrov smiled, a thin, humorless smile. "We are friends, John, and we believe in you. We believe you are capable of truly extraordinary things. Now the choice is yours. Embrace your destiny or return to your old life. But be warned, John, once you see the world through these eyes, it is impossible to unsee it." The offer was on the table. A life of unimaginable wealth paid for by the most dangerous intelligence agency in the world in exchange for becoming their unwitting or
Now, a witting asset. John Smith, the invisible man, had been seen. And now he had a choice to make. A choice that would not only define the rest of his life, but would echo through the silent battlefields of the Cold War. His life was about to change forever. But was it for the better? Or had he just signed his own death warrant? The answer, incredibly, lies not in capitalism, but in the dark, twisted halls of the Kremlin itself and the desperate gambles they were willing to make. The story, far from ending here, has only just begun. What John didn't know was that he was about to become the central figure in one of the most audacious and ultimately disastrous intelligence operations of the Cold War. This was only the very first step into a world of shadows, betrayals, and astonishing twists. And the next move? It wasn't his. It was theirs. What does a desperate man do when offered the impossible, a life of unimaginable wealth at the cost of his soul? John Smith stared at the offer, his eyes fixed on the blank space where the major project was to be detailed. $100 million. His mind reeled, trying to process the sheer scale of it. It was a sum that could obliterate every financial worry he'd ever known. A sum that could buy him not just freedom, but power, respect, a life he'd only seen in movies. But the chill in the air wasn't from the restaurant's AC, it was the icy realization of what this truly meant. Treason. Espionage, a clandestine world he had only read about in cheap paperbacks, now staring him in the face. Petrov, sensing John's turmoil, pushed a small engraved pen across the table. "No need to decide now, John. Take it, consider it, but know this. Opportunities like this, they do not come twice, and time, as always, is of the essence." John's hand, clammy and shaking, closed around the pen. He mumbled something about needing to think, and Petrov, with another thin smile, simply nodded. "We understand. We have faith you will make the right choice, John." He walked out of that restaurant in a daze, the manila envelope clutched like a live wire. The familiar streets looked alien, the sounds of traffic distant and muffled. He went home, locked his door, and spread the offer on his kitchen table, staring at it for hours. Sleep offered no escape. His dreams were a maelstrom of dollar signs, shadowy figures, and the cold, unblinking eyes of Petrov. The internal battle raged for 3 days. His conscience screamed no. His desperation whispered yes.
The memory of another eviction notice, the sting of creditors' calls, the hollow ache of constant worry, these were powerful adversaries to his moral compass. He remembered the feeling of being invisible, dismissed, a failure. This offer wasn't just money, it was validation. It was an escape from the crushing mediocrity that had defined his life. It was a chance to finally be someone, even if that someone was a Soviet asset. The choice, he convinced himself, wasn't between right and wrong, it was between survival and oblivion.
On the fourth day, John called Petrov. The voice on the other end was calm, expectant. John heard himself say, "I'll do it." The words felt heavy, foreign, yet undeniably his own. A wave of both relief and dread washed over him. The decision was made. The die was cast. His new life began subtly. The refrigeration surveys continued, but now with a sharp, explicit focus. Petrov provided lists of targets, defense contractors, research facilities, government storage depots, even specific university labs working on sensitive projects. John was instructed not just to observe, but to identify specific points of entry, security patrol patterns, camera locations, and even the schedules of key personnel. He was given a better camera, miniature recording devices disguised as everyday objects, and taught rudimentary tradecraft, dead drops, coded messages using newspaper classifieds, and secure communication protocols. The money started flowing, not in one lump sum, but in regular, hefty payments into an offshore account Petrov had set up. John watched his net worth skyrocket. He upgraded his apartment, bought new clothes, paid off every single debt, and even invested a little. He began to feel a sense of power, a dangerous thrill. He was no longer the invisible salesman. He was a man with a secret, a man playing a high-stakes game, and for the first time in his life, he felt truly alive. But with the thrill came paranoia. Every shadow seemed to hold an observer. Every unmarked car on the street felt like it was following him. He saw Petrov's assessing eyes in every stranger's gaze. The constant fear of exposure, of discovery, became his new companion. He knew the penalty for espionage. It was a long, cold cell, or worse. The weight of the $100 million promise was immense, but so was the weight of the secret. He was a rich man now, but also a prisoner of his own making, inextricably linked to the dangerous machinations of a foreign power. He had sold his soul, and now the payment was due, in installments of fear and stolen information. What could an industrial refrigeration salesman possibly gain access to that was so strategically vital it warranted a $100 million payout from the Soviets? As John delved deeper into his new role, the tasks escalated in complexity and risk. He wasn't just observing anymore, he was facilitating. He was a ghost in the machine, a legitimate reason to be in places others couldn't reach. His refrigeration expertise, once a mundane skill, became his perfect cover. He could request site visits to assess climate control needs, propose upgrades, or troubleshoot non-existent problems. This gave him unparalleled access to the inner workings of critical American infrastructure. Petrov's handlers, deep in Moscow, weren't interested in generic industrial data. They had a singular, focused objective: to close the technological gap in a specific, highly advanced field. The Cold War was not just about military might, it was a race for technological supremacy, and the prize they sought, the hidden jewel John was unknowingly helping them acquire, was rooted in a burgeoning American defense program involving cryogenic computing. In the early 1980s, the US was making significant strides in developing superconducting microprocessors, revolutionary technology that promised unprecedented computing power for missile guidance systems, code breaking, and advanced radar. These experimental systems operated at extremely low temperatures, often requiring specialized liquid helium or nitrogen cooling systems, precisely the kind of advanced refrigeration and climate control John Smith was supposedly an expert in. Petrov explained it to John not in terms of espionage, but as market research for a new highly specialized product line.
John was instructed to seek out facilities working on advanced low-temperature applications to gather data on their cooling requirements, the types of refrigerants used, the architectural layouts of their clean rooms, and especially the methods of waste heat dissipation from their cryogenic equipment. He was told to photograph ventilation systems, wiring schematics, and temperature control panels, seemingly innocent tasks for a refrigeration specialist. His most critical assignment came in the form of a major defense contractor in California, a facility known only by its code name, Project Nightingale. This was where the cutting edge of cryogenic computing was being housed, a deeply classified research and development hub. Petrov instructed John to secure a consultation contract there, leveraging his reputation, now bolstered by lavish gifts and success stories fabricated by Petrov, as a top-tier industrial refrigeration expert. John, fueled by the money and the intoxicating sense of purpose, pulled strings, buttered up mid-level managers, and exaggerated his credentials. Astonishingly, he succeeded. He secured a contract to evaluate the thermal management systems for Project Nightingale's new experimental wing. This was the holy grail for the Soviets. Inside Nightingale, John was escorted through sterile corridors, past heavily guarded doors, and into laboratories buzzing with hushed activity. He wasn't allowed into the innermost sanctum, but his access to the surrounding infrastructure, the cooling plants, the power distribution centers, and the ventilation shafts was enough. He meticulously documented everything, using tiny, undetectable cameras hidden in his watch and briefcase. He took samples of specialized coolants, sketched layouts of the building's critical arteries, and noted the precise locations of the most sensitive equipment. His reports to Petrov were gold. He wasn't just providing vague logistical data anymore. He was mapping the nervous system of America's most advanced technological secrets. He detailed how the cryogenic systems were integrated, how power was supplied, how environmental controls maintained the ultra-cold conditions. He even managed to photograph schematics of a new, highly efficient liquid helium recovery system, a piece of engineering brilliance that was critical to the long-term viability of cryogenic computing. The $100 million promise wasn't just for John's cooperation. It was for the access he provided, the legitimate cover he presented, that allowed the Soviets to build a comprehensive blueprint for their own cryogenic computing program, and more importantly, to understand the vulnerabilities of America's. John Smith, the forgotten salesman, was now the unwitting architect of a monumental intelligence coup. He had become the essential pivot point in a technological arms race, providing the critical pieces needed to steal a scientific leap. He was making history, one chilled-out mainframe at a time, entirely unaware of the strategic earthquake he was creating. How long could an ordinary man navigate a world of shadows, betrayals, and high-stakes espionage before the threads inevitably began to unravel? John's success at Project Nightingale sent ripples through the Soviet intelligence community. He had delivered beyond their wildest expectations. The payments increased, his assets grew, and he was instructed to prepare for a final, pivotal operation. Petrov became almost deferential, treating John not as an asset, but as a crucial, irreplaceable partner. But this new level of esteem only amplified John's terror. He was too deep. There was no going back. His life was a constant performance. He had to maintain the facade of a successful, if eccentric, refrigeration consultant. He had to remember every lie, every fabricated backstory. The immense wealth brought no peace, only a gilded cage of paranoia. He drank more, slept less, and the weight of his secret began to crush him. He started seeing things, a black sedan always parked a block from his apartment, a familiar face in the crowd at the airport. Were they Soviet handlers, or were they American counterintelligence? He didn't know which thought was more terrifying. The U.S. intelligence community, however, was not entirely blind. They were seeing anomalies, small, seemingly unrelated breaches of security at various defense contractor sites, a pattern of peculiar consultant visits to highly sensitive areas, all linked by a single common denominator: requests for advanced refrigeration system evaluations. The FBI's counterintelligence division, specifically a seasoned agent named Agent Eleanor Vance, started connecting the dots. her team flagged Project Nightingale as a particularly concerning target, noting an unusual increase in maintenance calls and consultation requests that seemed disproportionate to the actual issues reported. Vance, a meticulous and relentless investigator, started running background checks on all recent consultants at these flagged sites. John Smith's profile was initially unremarkable, a struggling salesman who suddenly hit it big. It wasn't unheard of in booming 80s America, but the sheer velocity of his financial turnaround, coupled with
His new, strangely specific expertise in cryogenic climate control, raised a red flag. The fact that his employer, Transcontinental Export and Import Co., was linked to several known Soviet front companies previously considered low-priority intelligence collection points screamed louder than any siren. They put John Smith under surveillance. Microphones were planted in his apartment. His phone was tapped. His movements were tracked. John, constantly on edge, felt the pressure mount, but he couldn't pinpoint the source. He suspected something, knew he was being watched, but the paranoia clouded his judgment. He attributed every oddity to his Soviet handlers, testing him, watching him. Then came the final instruction from Petrov. The major project was no longer blank. It was revealed in a coded message. John was to gain access to Project Nightingale one last time, under the guise of a critical system upgrade. But this time, his objective wasn't just information, it was acquisition. He was to retrieve a prototype superconducting chip, a device no larger than a thumbnail, from a specific cryogenic research module. This chip was the core component of the next generation of American strategic defense systems, and the $100 million would be his the moment he delivered it. John stared at the decoded message, his blood running cold. This wasn't just data, this was theft, a direct act of industrial espionage against his own country, carrying a potential death sentence. He was being asked to physically steal a piece of American ingenuity. The gravity of the situation slammed into him with the force of a freight train. He imagined the headlines, the humiliation, the sheer terror of being caught. He tried to refuse. He called Petrov, his voice trembling. "I can't do this. This is too much. I'm out." Petrov's calm, almost sympathetic voice responded, "John, my friend, there is no out. You are already in, and you have proven yourself too valuable to simply walk away. Think of the consequences of disappointment, John. We know where you live. We know your habits. We know everything." The threat was clear, chillingly delivered without a trace of anger. It wasn't a request anymore. It was an order. John hung up, his hands shaking so violently he almost dropped the phone. He was trapped. He was going to commit an outright treason or disappear. The $100 million seemed utterly worthless now, a mirage shimmering on the horizon of a nightmare. He was a pawn, played to perfection, and now he was being forced to make the ultimate move. The invisible man was about to become the most wanted man, a ghost in the machine, tasked with stealing the very heart of American technological superiority. The unraveling was complete. The trap had sprung shut. Was John Smith a desperate traitor, a brilliant opportunist, or simply the most spectacularly unlucky man in Cold War history? And how did a $100 million offer for a refrigeration salesman ever see the light of day? The night before the scheduled system upgrade at Project Nightingale, John was a wreck. He sat alone in his apartment, the prototype retrieval instructions laid out before him, a small, specialized toolkit glinting under the dim light. His mind raced, desperate for an escape, any escape. He considered calling the FBI, confessing everything, but the thought of Petrov's chilling threats, the potential harm to his distant family, and the almost certain prospect of spending his life in prison paralyzed him. He was alone, utterly and completely caught between two superpowers. What he didn't know was that Agent Vance and her team were already closing in. They had watched him for weeks, confirming their suspicions. The coded messages, the furtive meetings, the sudden wealth, it all painted a damning picture. They knew about the system upgrade at Nightingale. They knew it was a pretense, and they were waiting. The morning of the operation, as John, wired and terrified, drove his car towards Project Nightingale, he was intercepted. Two unmarked sedans boxed him in. Agent Vance, her face grim, approached his car window. "John Smith, you're under arrest." The relief that washed over John was profound, immediate, and utterly shocking. It was over. The nightmare was finally ending, even if it meant prison. He confessed everything, the whole sordid tale from the initial cold call to the $100 million offer for the chip. He laid it all out, a torrent of fear, regret, and relief.
The FBI was stunned. $100 million offer for a superconducting chip facilitated by a refrigeration salesman? It was audacious, unprecedented. It was the largest single intelligence payout ever recorded or even contemplated by the Soviets for an individual asset. The scale of the offer confirmed just how critical this technology was to Moscow and how desperate they were to acquire it. But here's where the mystery of the $100 million offer truly unravels. The FBI, through meticulous investigation and John's detailed confession, discovered the true strategic brilliance and ultimate failure of the KGB's plan. The Soviets weren't just after the chip. They knew that replicating the technology would be incredibly difficult, even with a physical prototype. What they really wanted was to force the US to reveal its counter-espionage capabilities. The $100 million was a lure, a massive, undeniable bait designed to expose if the US had knowledge of or could track such a high-stakes intelligence operation. By offering such an astronomical sum, the KGB was testing the American reaction. Would they catch John? How quickly? How would they react to the breach? It was a sophisticated vital secrets. If the operation went off without a hitch, the Soviets would get the chip and confirm American incompetence. If it was caught, as it was, they would learn invaluable lessons about how the US identified and neutralized such threats. The offer itself was a weapon, designed not just to acquire, but to probe. John Smith, the poor salesman, was not just a spy. He was a canary in the coal mine. His value wasn't just in the information he provided, or even the chip he was supposed to steal. His true strategic value in the eyes of Moscow was as a catalyst to expose the unseen layers of American defense. The mystery of the $100 million wasn't just what they wanted, but why they were willing to put such an outrageous figure on it, understanding that such an offer would inevitably draw attention. John Smith served 12 years in a federal penitentiary for espionage, a sentence mitigated by his full cooperation. He was debriefed extensively, his knowledge of Soviet tradecraft and methodologies proving invaluable to American counterintelligence efforts. He emerged a free man, stripped of his wealth, which was seized by the government, but also of his paranoia. He was an American poor salesman who got a $100 million offer mysteriously, and the mystery wasn't just the amount, but the intricate, multi-layered game of Cold War chess being played with his life as the ultimate pawn. His story, once a footnote in intelligence archives, now stands as a chilling testament to the desperate, ingenious, and often tragically human elements of Cold War espionage. The Cold War is over, but the games of espionage continue, evolving with every new technological leap. If you're interested in another story of how a seemingly insignificant piece of data can trigger a global intelligence crisis, then you need to watch our next video, The Mole Who Hacked History: How a Single Floppy Disk Exposed America's Nuclear Secrets.